Hi, this is Paul. I hope you've been enjoying all the conversations I've been having. I've just not had time to sit down and make another really long video. And the video that I've been wanting to make for a while has been the video on the subject of, well, why the fight over woke religion. A couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with James Lindsay, and I was very happy with the way that conversation went. I had never met James. I had reached out to him. He was very gracious and in giving me some time to talk to me, and I thought the conversation was very productive. I certainly enjoyed it and got a lot out from it. One of the things that I hadn't realized until I spoke with him was the way in which the new atheist community has been split by this new woke religion. And I was struck when I first got the news of the Grievance Scholar paper project. And what interested me was how, of the three, Peter Boghossian was the only name that I recognized, and I recognized his name from some conversations he had with Phil Visser and his manual for creating atheists. And so I knew he was kind of a, I hope he takes no offense if he ever watches this, he's kind of a B level. If you have the four horsemen, they're the A level. He's kind of a B level new atheist. And I thought it was interesting that he was part of this little conspiracy to out the fake science of the grievance studies. And it wasn't until I talked to James that I was able to kind of put it together and realize that where this battle is in terms of the new atheist movement that's been around for really a couple of decades. Now, I've said in many of my other videos that I think the culture war that the West is currently experiencing is a Christendom culture war, a Christendom civil war. And the fight against atheist woke religion is a new atheist civil war. And again, I didn't realize that until I talked to James. And in many ways, this is the battle for the Bible for the scientistic crowd. Now, those of you who may not know a lot of church history might not know that after Darwin, in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a huge battle between what were called the modernists and the fundamentalists. And one of the key books that came out of that period came from J. Gresham Machen, from what was called, at least when I was in seminary in the 80s, the old Princeton School. Because what was happening was that there was an existential crisis within Christianity in Europe and America over science versus religion. And as this comic in the center has, you had people imagined, at least Christians imagined, that this was a steady decline of loss of the faith down through these stairs of the Bible is not infallible, man is not made in God's image, no miracles, no virgin birth, no deity, no atonement, no resurrection, agnosticism, atheism. And this was kind of the liberal staircase downwards from faith into no faith. And so we've lived with this dynamic for a long time. And what happened during that period of time was that there was a big fight over institutions, and it was happening in every college and every seminary around the United States. And what tended to happen was that seminaries proliferated. For example, the old Princeton School, where J. Gresham Machen taught, became liberal, and Westminster Theological Seminary was formed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as kind of the conservative alternative. And this happened throughout the United States. Now, it's important to remember that a few decades before that, similar things had happened with respect to abolition and slavery. That was very much a north-south split. But this split was all through the West, as they were grappling with what does the rise of Darwinian science mean. And so then kind of old atheism came up, and then in the 80s and 90s and aughts we had new atheism and the things that were, and this is something that many of us are familiar with. Every Easter, the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Sacramento will put up a billboard like this guy, and I've had the picture in before. And what I realized is that, well, obviously the new atheists are not fighting a battle of the Bible. They are fighting a battle of science and a battle of knowledge and a battle of basically in terms of the foundations of their world. Now, I'm not going to run through the history of science and religion and the Reformation and the turn to texts and the turn away from texts. I've run through that history in a number of my other videos. I'm just going to refer to it here. But this woke religion. So when Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and others note that what they're seeing is not so much science in the academy, but a religion, that of course in a new atheist context is a slur. They're basically saying, you know, you're religious just like all these other people that we've defeated. Now, one of the things that comes up again and again, people send me letters because of my channel, and they talk to me about why they became an atheist. Maybe they were raised Christian, but they became an atheist because they'd see the new atheist in their mind beat Christian apologists again and again on stage. Now, part of the dynamics of these conversations, if you watch the Jordan Peterson, Matt Dillahunty, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations, is that so often both groups leave unconvinced, simply hardened in their allegiance to whichever side they came into the theater with. So it's those events aren't exactly the kind of thing that people would like them to be. Usually it's people going in there to cheer their heroes. But what's happening with this, with the hoax papers and with this new movement and with its relationship with religion, which I think is very right. If you listen to my conversation with James Lindsay, I think he and I are very much on the same page that this is a religion. And I came to this because I began to see in 4 or 5 years ago, the development of this within Christian churches. And the more I listened, the more I began to say something similar to what, say, J. Gresham Machen was saying, is that this is very much a religious movement. Now, I wouldn't be surprised by that, seeing it in a church, but this is distinct from the Christianity that I was expecting to see. And so increasingly I began to call it progressive liberationism, because I began to see it as distinct from, say, traditional Christianity or the confessional Christianity that was supposed to be which is practiced in the Christian Reformed Church. And so I began to study it and tried to figure out what was going on. And as I was continuing to think about that and research that, that's where I came across Jordan Peterson. And so then things were starting to sort of fit together for me. And that's, in a sense, how I got into this. And then when I saw Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay talking, it was like, yeah, this is what I've been studying all along. But I'm not part of the new atheist camp looking at these guys. I'm part of the camp in the Christian church watching this same thing happen in the church. Now, terms are sometimes different, but it's amazing how much it's the same. And I'm going to talk about that as we go in this a little bit more. But let's first talk about the schism in the new atheists. One of the things that's helpful for me looking at this new religion as a pastor is I know religion, and there are already categories that I can employ. To give a little bit of my own, to lay some of my own cards on the table, I think religions are ways that we answer basic questions about the world. And that's very close to Jordan Peterson's definition of these are the axiomatic principles that we hold within us and express by our actions, express by the values that we articulate in language. This is our religion. And this is why when Jordan Peterson called Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty religious, and in fact Christian, or at least Christianish, they took offense. But to me, there's no question about that, because they are to borrow some terminology from the woke religion or the progressive liberationists, they're very much downstream from Christianity, and they're not owning a lot of the formation that they simply have picked up in terms of their culture, and they don't realize what part of Christianity they have simply assumed in terms of the moral system that they share with a great many of their allies and adversaries. But now in terms of the new atheist community and where this schism is happening, part of what we see are what I would call gradualist utopians and aggressive utopians. So for example, Sam Harris, I would say, would be a gradualist utopian in that he imagines, when he's talking to Jordan Peterson, that reason is going to continue to grow and eventually prevail. Okay, and this is very much a page taken from the early 20th century, when it was imagined that religion will continue to recede and reason will flourish and religion will be put away and we'll all become rational and so on and so forth. And as Jordan Peterson noted, he doesn't believe that, and frankly, neither do I. But politics and education are the means of progress. And if someone is showing themselves to be religious, what they really need is education, and education in science, and education in philosophy and math, and hopefully this religious superstition can pass away. But this will be done individually and with liberty. There's not going to be any witch trials here, no guns to the head. We want to persuade people with arguments. And the new atheists, this is what they've done. They want to persuade people with arguments, and they've often felt that religion has been tyrannical and religion has been no, I gotta turn off that computer noise. So basically the gradualist utopians like Sam Harris believe that with freedom of speech, with good conversation, with good education, people can be liberated from their religious superstition, and the world will get increasingly secular and rational, and then life will be better. That's basically their agenda. That's part of their eschatology. And it's a progressivist eschatology. And religion, though, is defined as an ancient mythos thinking. That's key here, because they would argue that they're not religious because they're secular or atheist. Now, that depends on your definition of religion. Now, Jordan Peterson and I both would say, no, you really are religious. Secularism is a sort of religion. Atheism, okay, you say just atheism is not believing that there's a God. I would say, yeah, but there's a system that comes around it, a group of axiomatic beliefs that are getting expressed and that are getting acted out. And so religion is simply a function of all human beings in terms of our axiomatic behavior, whereas they would say religion is ancient mythos thinking, and that will be replaced and will recede before science and technology, and that's the subtraction story that Charles Taylor talks about. But the new woke religionists are really aggressive utopians and getting increasingly tyrannical, as we've been seeing. Politics and social engineering are a means of progress, whereas the gradualist utopians are imagining that good argumentation, people will slowly come of their own free will, and we can take our time, but bit by bit we'll get creation science and prayer and all of those things out of the school, and real science will develop. Our freedom from religion foundations will increasingly stop things like prayer before Congress or before football games or some of these things, and churches will continue to decline, so on and so forth. But the aggressive utopians really want to take hold and say it needs to happen faster than this because lives are at stake and feelings are being hurt, and the patriarchy and white supremacy continue to be imbued in people around. So we must eliminate these things by taking control of social institutions, including educational institutions and political institutions, so we can rid the world of these unjust maladies. So equity in that case is above liberty. Group is above individual. And someday you'll thank us after all, and your children certainly will, because it's for your own good. There's often an implicit elitism in the gradualist utopians, but there's usually a denied elitism, but a very aggressive one in the aggressive utopians, because after all, we need to save you, and we need to save you quick. Now religions, they're probably not quite as reactive to religions, because probably increasingly they'll see certain Christian groups as their allies, for reasons that I'm going to get into in a little bit. So the new Atheist Schism, one way we could categorize it would be that Sam Harris, James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, Jordan Peterson, these continue to be classical liberals. Let's call them the right side of the schism versus the right versus the left. Now, of course, many of these individuals, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, politically, in terms of the standard spectrum before the Trump era, would not have been considered on the right at all politically, but now suddenly they are forced over to the right by the increasingly active further left. And so the woke warriors or the social justice warriors or the woke religionists or the progressive liberationists, we'll consider them to be the left. The classical liberals will basically have a modernistic agenda, objective truth first, freedom of speech. The world is a space of objects. Subjective experience follows objective arrangement, or the perceptive of objective arrangement and relationships. In Ian McGilchrist terms, they're very left-brained. Now the woke warriors, subjective experience first. The injustice is felt and perceived, and you might not be able to see it in an objective world, but it's certainly felt. It's intuitive, and here this is a difference between them. And what we're going to find is that a lot of these cross pressures begin going different ways as we begin to look how this new conflict realigns the old alliances. So woke warriors see from subjective experience first. I can feel the oppression against me, and I can see the oppression in others. And just by virtue of a connection with a MAGA hat, the Covington boys were seen as I forget who wrote it. The MAGA hat is the new white hood, and this isn't an objective truth. This is felt and intuited. Intuition and perception maps onto objects. Okay, so the MAGA hat becomes the new white hood. Rearrange objects according to an intuitive agenda. We're going to feel our way through this to find this landscape of justice and equity and freedom from discrimination of every sort. Very much models a therapeutic approach, and compared especially to the classical liberals and the objectivists over on the now to the right of them, it's very therapeutic, it's very feeling issued, and at least initially they were adopting very therapeutic language, but as you resist ongoing therapy and re-education, the efforts get more and more determined and less voluntary. And so in some ways they're a little bit more over here on the right brain. All right? Now, meanwhile, in religious communities like Christian communities, this is making for some weird scrambling, and actually in some ways left and right isn't probably the best way to approach it. Maybe a historical layer approach is best, because in many ways the classical liberals that are the right wing of the new theists are very much left brain. And they will align because they've been classically butting heads with the left brains of the religious community. Modernistic Protestants that love to do apologetics have been the front line against the classical liberal new atheists. The emphasis has been on objective texts. So now some of the new teaching objectivists will say, well, that violates the text, and the emphasis is on law. Now this very much comes into play with the questions of women in church office, the questions of LGBT inclusion in church communities. That's really where this new woke religion versus kind of the traditional religions practiced in denominations really became enjoined in 2013 when, for example, the Supreme Court handed down their decision. Now you'll find that for the most part, the intellectual dark web, with the exception of Ben Shapiro. See, Ben Shapiro is really kind of an outlier there because he's a traditional religionist, all right? And also sort of libertarian, and so there's plenty of nuance, but all the rest of them will very quickly trot out their credentials in terms of LGBT issues, or at least LG issues, lesbian and gay issues, and that's where that faction is having some of its own cross pressures internally. So of course Jordan Peterson gets hung up on pronouns in C16, and this is where we really begin to see the rift in the new atheist communities. But this has been happening in religious communities, not just Christian ones, religious communities for a while. But the left brain religious communities, and again, left brain, sometimes it's left, sometimes it's right, but this is Ian McGilchrist talk, his terminology, emphasizing community, unity, and conformity, okay? The right brain religious communities emphasizing intuitive individual freedom over conformities. And so now, before we really got into the woke religion battle, some of the battles were more between the left brain and right brain religious communities. Now, how can we track these changes? Some of the best ways to track a lot of changes in religion is to watch what's happening with food and sex. And you might think, well, okay, sex I can understand, but food? Food and sex traditionally and are always show up as markers in religious communities because there will be either prohibitions or liberties around food and sex, and these very much often mark transitions and kind of locate communities throughout time. And I see them as sort of benchmarks for seismic change. Now, the reason we're so surprised that I would put food on that list is the deep impact of Protestant libertarian food stance has obscured it for many. Protestants will eat just about anything. Now, when I was growing up, the Roman Catholics in northern New Jersey were still eating fish on Friday, which meant that the deli just down the street from the bakery where I work, they had wonderful fish on Friday. I used to love to get fish on Friday. But we Protestants, going all the way back to the Reformation, Protestants and Reformed Christians were sometimes known as sausage eaters. And part of the reason they would eat sausage on no meat days and on fast days was to prove their Christian liberty to their Roman Catholic adversaries. And you can see where food then becomes elements in these wars. All right. Now, those of you who live in California know that we have legislation about the feelings of chickens with respect to cage-free chickens or cage-free eggs from cage-free chickens. Know that, suddenly everybody's paying attention to food. And if your children are going to public school in California, you'll probably notice that somewhere in high school, some of them will suddenly become vegan because, well, now there's moral status in food. Now, sex has obviously been another area that there's always a lot of movement, and this has been there too. Now, food and sex are two of our strongest biological drives, and this is part of the reason that you can always kind of look at what's going on in religious communities, ask someone, what are you and aren't you allowed to eat? What is moral about food? What moral status will you lose by eating certain foods, and will you gain by eating certain foods? So, for example, if you eat a lot of beef, maybe you don't care about the environment. If you're a vegan, well, why are you a vegan? Well, I'm against industrial farming and the cruelty that happens in animals, or I'm against use of antibiotics or growth hormones in animals, and so on and so forth. And so you can see that even though we haven't really connected food very strongly with religion, increasingly we will see that. All right. So you can track change by paying attention to moral discussions around food and sex. Now also, as you listen to this, pay attention to health, because health is a loaded term. Religions are always looking for flourishing, or as Charles Taylor says, fullness, but pay attention to how bounded by secularity or transcending into an afterworld or otherworld. Which health? So, maybe you're fasting during fast times as an Orthodox Christian or a Roman Catholic Christian or a Muslim, or you're very scrupulous about being vegetarian as a Buddhist or a Hindu. And you say, well, what health are you looking for? Well, maybe you're looking for spiritual health. Now fasting is in the Protestant churches as well, but Protestant fasting tends to be more episodic, usually in connection with prayer, rather than the church calendar in connection with feast days and holy days and fasting periods, as with Lent. And so again, food is a pretty good tracker, but so is sex. Now, just as you had kind of a Protestant libertarianism whitewash our ability to track food as a religious marker, the dominance of the Protestant sexual ethic in the West has kind of obscured that. And so the West had, at least in the United States and Europe, sexual ethic didn't differentiate Roman Catholic and Protestant too much. It did with respect to contraception, but for the most part, Protestants and Catholics have had a similar sexual ethic. And it hasn't been far from, let's say, Buddhists or some other groups in some ways. Now, again, religion is enormously diverse, and so it's hard to make easy, quick categorizations. But a lot of this has to do, again, with health. Is health perceived as this worldly health? That would be partly the impact of secularism. When you look at the dietary laws in the Old Testament of clean and unclean food, often modernists want to map on health to those laws, but biblical scholars have actually rejected this for quite a long time. It's not health that they're dealing with. They're dealing with symbolic representations of metaphysical realities. Okay? And which, even with the Protestant sausage eating on Fridays against Roman Catholics, there too is, in a sense, a theological mapping. The Protestants wanted to talk about religious freedom and the priesthood of all believers and one speed versus two speed, so on and so forth. But now you'll find that food and morality are increasingly linked again. You've got individual liberty versus community. And now in our society, this tends to get played out more in vice areas like soda. Do you have the big sugar tax to as a public health matter to lower obesity? How is alcohol regulated or controlled? Is there social stigma or status loss with drinking alcohol? You'll find that in some religious communities, certain conservative Christian communities, Islamic communities. What about drugs? What about pot? Now, legalization of pot is so new, churches really haven't engaged in this or figured this out. And as I've said in many other videos, churches move at a very different clock speed than everyone else, so that will probably take some time. But over the next 20 years, watch churches as they try to figure out what kinds of prohibitions there will be with respect to pot and other drugs that are legalized. This will get very interesting when it comes to psychedelics. If the conversation that is emerging, this has all been new to me, of the Jordan Peterson movement as this comes to churches. And again, in California, we've seen this as free-range chicken and eggs. And I simply feel more moral by eating a chicken that I imagined, in terms of my projection of chicken consciousness, had a more humane life than an inhumane life. And I don't say that to mock it, but that's really sort of what we're talking about. And I don't say that as to dismiss questions of animal cruelty. Animal cruelty has been an issue for many Christians. Actually, animal cruelty was a very big issue for C.S. Lewis. In order to locate this, I wanted to pull up a very interesting question, because if I talk about Christianity and LGBT issues, that's been something that is very much a topic of public conversation. For example, Mike Pence's wife goes back to teaching at a Christian school that has pretty much traditional Christian teaching with respect to LGBT issues and same-sex marriage. So then I think it's helpful to look at someone like the Dalai Lama, because the Dalai Lama is someone for whom many in the woke religion camp would say, well, we certainly don't want to align ourselves with these Christians who say no to same-sex marriage and all of these things. We certainly have a great deal of esteem and respect for the Dalai Lama. But if you do any amount of Googling, you'll discover that really should be to nobody's surprise. The Dalai Lama's conversations about sexuality have been interesting. In 1994, in an interview with Out magazine, he said, if someone comes to me and asks whether homosexuality is okay or not, I will ask, what is your companion's opinion? But if you both agree, then I would say, two males or two females voluntarily agree to have mutual satisfaction without further implications of harming others, then it's okay. The interview is not available anywhere online, so the context of the quote is not known. But then you go to May 25, 1999, the Dalai Lama says, they want me to condone homosexuality, but I'm a Buddhist. And for a Buddhist, a relationship between two men is wrong. Some sexual contact in marriage is wrong, speaking regarding masturbation and oral sex. And I thought, well, that was interesting. Also saying that if an individual has no faith, then it's a different matter. If two men love each other and are not religious, then that is okay by me. And so what's interesting, again, and this is typical of religion, there's a lot of nuance here in terms of categories. If you're a Buddhist, well, why are the rules different if you're a Buddhist? Well, they're different if you're a Buddhist because your Buddhism is contextualizing your life goals. That's how religion works. You have a different set of axiomatic principles than a non-Buddhist, and so for the Dalai Lama, he kind of susses out the different norms with respect to some of these different things. Now, many of you listening to that might be a little bit surprised. And in keeping with that, in 2014, he got asked this again, and he said it's okay as long as you don't violate your chosen religion. And so you can, if you kind of understand how Buddhism works, you might be able to see why the Dalai Lama would have the stance that he's had. So, but now start paying attention to where all of this is going. Health. Health in what way? Is it tied to natural law? All right. Or is it tied to other metaphysical or metaphorical stories that are playing? Liberty. Well, consenting adults. But those who are really hoping that this idea of consent won't move anywhere should continue to pay attention to what is consent and what is it based on. Consent is based on a certain anthropology, a certain, frankly, religious anthropology, a question about what is a human being and what is choice and which human beings can offer choice. And this obviously is built into our laws. Now, increasingly, we see news popping up of celebrities and others raising children without gender. Why? Because they believe that, in a sense, their children should consent to their gender mapping. And this is leading to a lot of the questions about children transitioning medically and having transitional surgery when they're still minors. Transitioning children with or without parental consent for the health, the mental health, the identity, which is tied to mental health of the child. So again, you can begin to see all of this stuff track. Now, this has been making its way through the churches, and for those of you paying attention to Christian denominations, some of the biggest fights that we've been seeing and biggest splits have been over same-sex marriage and LGBTQ issues following women in church office issues. There are a number of splits in denominations, including the Christian Reformed Church, over women in church office, but the LGBTQ splits will probably be bigger and more painful. We've seen that in the Presbyterian Church of the USA. We've seen that among the Anglicans. Right now, currently among the Methodists, that's happening. And these are really big fights. And now, again, we're not really usually paying too much attention. What is all of this stuff tied to? Now, just a couple of days ago, Dreher wrote, I think, a Rod Dreher, he writes on the American Conservative, he brought up Rene Girard and the Covington Catholic boys. And what he notes is, he doesn't necessarily draw all of these things together, but the long-term connection between this religion that values the least of these and also victim. And this is where Girard comes in. And he begins with a quote from Bishop Barron, long reader of Girard, who wrote a piece commenting on the, I'll leave some of these links in the comment section, commenting on what happened with the Covington boys on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And then Dreher gets into Girard's book, I See Satan Falling Like Lightning. I'll skip down a little bit. In I See Satan Falling Like Lightning, Girard writes about how the concern for victims is what sets Christianity and Judaism apart from all other archaic religions. This concern for victims is now being virtually universalized, okay? And this is where, in a sense, Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty, although they be atheists, yet act like Christians and are receiving the influence of Christianity in them, but this is also happening in terms of the woke religion. This concern for the victim has now been virtually universalized. Well, maybe I'll make the text bigger here. All right. Even paradoxically, as Christianity has begun to decline, at least in the West, you could say, but Girard doesn't, at least not here, that communism is a godless absolutizing of concern for the victims. See, now, I really don't think that's what communism is about. Communism is, in a sense, concerned for the victims based on 19th century industrialization and Marx's ideas of production and his economics. But they mostly framed it in terms of class, and what we see happening now is more an imagined emotional victimhood. So we're worried about the victimization of chickens, and we're worried about the victimization of sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. What sets it apart from Nazism is that Nazism was a massive attempt to refute concern for victims as a basis for society. Following Nietzsche, Nazism condemned Christianity as slave morality, Nietzsche's phrase, because it taught people how to have compassion for the weak and the unfit. This is very Christian. Communism was a pseudo-religion that tries to put a victim class on top in a utopian push to right historic wrongs. I don't know if Dreher is right here that that's historic communism. That might be, as Jordan Peterson calls, bloody postmodernism, postmodern neo-Marxism. That would very much be the way Jordan Peterson would categorize it. And this very much is, I think, what we're seeing now, perhaps not what we saw in the early 20th century with the rise of Lenin and Bolshevism in the Soviet Union. In a fascinating chapter on Nietzsche, Girard credits the philosopher with understanding the anthropological meaning of Christianity, but faults him for rejecting it. This is Girard. He opposes, so he believes, the crowd mentality, but he does not recognize his Dionysian stance as the supreme expression of the mob in its most brutal and most stupid tendencies. Now, again, you can debate Girard and Nietzsche here. I just having enough conversations with some of you about Nietzsche, I can very much imagine that. Back to Girard, or Dreher quoting Girard. Christianity does not yield its ulterior motives for resentment in its concern to rehabilitate victims. It is not seduced by contaminated charity of resentment. What it does is to rectify the illusion of myths. It exposes the lie of satanic accusation. Since Nietzsche is blind to mimetic rivalry, a key Girardian concept, this is what causes violence, and its contagion, he doesn't see that the gospel stance towards victims does not come from prejudice in favor of weak against strong, but it's heroic resistance to violent contagion. And this is where Girard gets very interesting. Indeed, the Gospels embody the discernment of a small minority that dares to oppose the monstrous mimetic contagion of Dionysian lynching. Now, when it comes to woke religion, the Dionysian lynching will come as in a sense, post-Christian behavior, both within woke Christian religionists and woke atheists. Because what you don't have is a full enough eschatology that will support Christians themselves becoming victims for the sake of victims, even to the cost of death. And this is a consequence of secularity. Now here's where Girard becomes, back to Dreher, here's where Girard becomes especially interesting and relevant to our moment. He says that today we hear repeatedly in every way that we no longer have an absolute, but in fact the concern for victims is our absolute. That is, it is the basis of our morality. It is the concern for victims that determines what is most important. That goes to the top of the hierarchy. This is the case because all other sources of absolute value have been lost. Why? Well, the history of the 19th and 20th century, the rise and replacement of Christian morality, actually the trying to maintain Christian morality without the metaphysical and metaphorical underpinnings. Back to Girard. The current process of spiritual demagoguery and rhetorical overkill has transformed the concern for victims into a totalitarian command and a permanent inquisition. We are living through caricatural ultra-Christianity that tries to escape from the Judeo-Christian orbit by radicalizing the concern of victims in an anti-Christian manner. In other words, they take a goal of Christianity and use a non-Christian method of trying to come to terms and realize that goal. The intellectuals and the other cultural elites have promoted Christianity to the role of number one scapegoat. Girard says we are at the advent of what he calls the other totalitarianism, saying that it is, back to Girard, the most cunning and malicious of the two, the one with the greatest future, by all evidence. At present, it does not oppose Judeo-Christian aspirations. It is now, Girard is writing a little before us, but claims them as its own, in the church, I would say, and in the atheist community. At present, it does not oppose Judeo-Christian aspirations, but claims them as its own and questions the concern for victims on the part of Christians, not without certain semblance of reason at the level of concrete action, given the deficiencies of historical Christianity. The other totalitarianism does not openly oppose Christianity, but outflanks it on the left wing. And that's exactly what's been happening in Christian denominations. This is the force of what in the Christian tradition is called Antichrist. I'd have a conversation with Dreher on that. I'm reading Dreher again. You don't have to believe in a literal Antichrist to grasp what Girard is saying here. Girard points out that in the symbolic language of the New Testament, Antichrist opposes Christ by imitating him and seeking to be better than him. That is correct. More from Girard. The Antichrist boasts of bringing to human beings the peace and tolerance that Christianity promises, but has failed to deliver. Actually, what the radicalization of contemporary victimology produces is a return to all sorts of pagan practices: abortion, euthanasia, sexual undifferentiation, Roma circus games galore, but without real victims, etc. No horses were harmed in the making of this movie. Neo-paganism would like to turn the Ten Commandments and all Judeo-Christian morality into some alleged intolerable violence, and indeed its primary objective is their complete abolition. Faithful observance of the moral law is perceived complicity with the forces of persecution that are essentially religious. Since the Christian denominations have become only tardily aware of their failings in charity, their connivance with the established political order in the past and present would have always world that are always sacrificial. They are particularly vulnerable to the ongoing blackmail of contemporary neo-paganism. Neo-paganism locates happiness in the unlimited satisfaction of desires, which means the suppression of all prohibitions. This idea acquires a semblance of credibility in the limited domain of consumer goods, whose prodigious multiplication, thanks to technological progress, weakens certain mimetic rivalries. The weakening of mimetic rivalries confers an appearance of plausibility, but only that on the stance that turns the moral law into an instrument of repression and persecution. Back to Dreher. And it happens when, having cut down all the moral laws to build a brave new world of unlimited satisfaction, the money runs out and the economy collapses. In his final chapter, Girard praises heroism of the scattered disciples in the wake of Jesus' resurrection. They had no power, in fact, knew that they had participated in the violent contagion that murdered their master, for example, Peter's denial. What they had was the power of their belief and their ability to communicate what they had seen and experienced, and this ultimately subverted the dominant paradigm of the ancient world, which believed that scapegoats were real and necessary. And I very much recommend the whole piece by Dreher. So full implicit new atheist adoption of the least of these morality. This is a woke pre-split. What this means is that this morality, this Christian morality of the least of these, and concerned for what I sometimes call mental suffering egalitarianism, because it's at that level that this group is focusing. This has been adopted by the new atheists as a whole. This is Christian. You're not going to find the current least of these morality from the Greeks or the Romans. The Romans didn't really care about how their slaves felt. And if you want to reference this, look up Tom Holland, who is a historian of the Roman period. And I played a little bit of that conversation between N.T. Wright and Tom Holland that you can find on Unbelievable. Christian failure of its own ethos has been a stock element of new atheist, anti-Christian, anti-theistic assault. God is not good. And so basically what new atheists have used against Christians and against Christianity and against Christian apologists is saying basically, your system has not lived up to the implicit imagined eschatology of least of these morality. Your system has been bad for women, bad for gays, bad for slaves, and so now we are going to take this at the top of our hierarchy. We're going to put the elimination of anguish of least of these people at the top of our hierarchy. We're not going to call it religious, but that's going to be our guiding star. Now, you should pay attention, especially to a writer like Miroslav Volf in this, because Volf came out of the breakdown of Yugoslavia and the Serbian conflicts. And what he noticed is that the secularism or the atheism that was present in that system actually made the bloodbaths worse, because you don't wait around for God to rescue you. It's up to humanity to save this world. And if you let your enemies get away with murder now, well, there's no God that will judge them and send them to hell in the future. You've put away all that. You've got to get them now. And you've got to, in order to bring heaven on earth, as I've said many times, you're going to bring up hell, and that's exactly what comes. The time frame is my little short life. Now, there's some ties here to health and wealth Christianity and certain elements in Christianity there. You want your best life now, and you need it now. And so if you have to get it now at the expense of your enemies, well, that's what your moral system calls you to do. Now, these pressures get intensified in woke Christian settings as well, and people will often notice the relationship between secularism and increasing what I call progressive liberationist Christians in terms of their battles, current battles for institutional dominance in Christian denominations. Now, a little bit later, I'm going to play a little bit from Tim Keller. I'm going to skip this slide for now. I'm just going to use him as the conclusion. Now, again, this presumed morality, which is brought in from Christianity, the new atheists have used against Christendom. And the new atheists, I think, were always a bit naive about the definition of religion, and now they are getting schooled in the practice of religion, because at least among Christians, the practice of the Christian religion wasn't, as Jordan Peterson says, reduced to a crippled ideology, which is a crippled religion. On one hand, Christians pursued many of their values, and back to the 1980s and the rise of the religious right, trying to put them into law, and that's a whole debate. But Christians always had other elements of their faith that at least had the chance to draw them back. Because on one hand, Jesus certainly in the Sermon on the Mount gives moral prescriptions. He also says, love your enemies. And so there are all these counterbalancing things going on within Christianity that often, not always, often kept people from falling into full-blown utopianism with Christianity. But now, the new atheist right, the classical liberals, still embrace the human nature. And so when we talk about social constructionism, this is where Brett Weinstein, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson come in and say, hey, wait a minute, there is an order here. And that at least leaves room for what Catholics and Christians would call natural law, or what, again, a term that I've used that some of you have gotten interested in, which is natural theology, which is, I think, exactly what Jordan Peterson is doing. But so in other words, there's a progression here, and that makes the new atheists like Sam Harris and Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay part of the new atheist right, and that progression continued on into the woke religionists, and in a sense they came full circle back into a new religion. And so, ironically, what in a sense you have are the religious and atheists modernists in alignment, because they're still looking at, for the atheists, scientific ideas, and for the Christians, textual ideas as their foundation, whereas the new foundations are much more experiential. I know this is wrong because I can feel the pain of oppression in my soul. And therefore, we as a community, we can imagine the painful oppression of these people in my soul. So we must now ally to banish the world of that suffering. Now, if you haven't seen it, I'm very much eager for part 2. It's been a while since part 1 came out. You should definitely watch this video on the channel of the hoax paper perpetrators, and I'll put a link in it. Now, I'm going to jump into a place. Hopefully, I've got it here.
He hired a friend of his to interview.
And this is Brett Weinstein and his wife talking about what happened at Evergreen. And when I watched this video, I thought, wow, this is so religious, because the ways that those who pushed Brett and his wife out of the college, these people sound just like a lot of church stuff that I've grown up with and seen. So let's hear a little bit of it.
A great many students, faculty, alumni, staff, in order to get the lay of the land.
So a new president comes into college and he's trying to get the lay of the land.
And Evergreen, being as far left of college as exists in the country, was chronically suspicious, the faculty were, of administrators.
So very egalitarian, very nervous about authoritarian, and this is very common amongst college. This is very common amongst college faculties. And one of the things that's been happening in college faculties over the last 30 years is really this move towards administrative control over faculty control. And I've been involved in a lot of conversations with former professors from Calvin College who will give you chapter and verse in this struggle over at Calvin College and in many other institutions. This is a far broader movement that's been happening. More and more power away from faculty, more and more power to administration.
Right. Anything administration wanted to do, the faculty would, if anything, they were biased in favor of discussing it more than necessary and not letting anything pass because basically it was labor versus management in everybody's mind.
The job this president, who was...
Okay, labor versus management. Okay, so, leftist faculty, a little bit Marxist, so, hey, we're the workers here. Don't alienate us from the fruit of our labor.
Clearly out to do something, had in front of him was, how am I going to convince this very left-leaning faculty to not only look the other way while I make radical changes to the college, but actually embrace my bloat of administration and my tearing down of the Evergreen model. How can I do that? I can do it by embracing equity.
You can do it by embracing equity. Why? Because equity is already at the top of the implicit religious hierarchy.
We have three major goals for today's forum. The first is to continue to learn about the perceptions and experiences of our students, faculty, and staff of color. The second is to create and establish a series of action items. And the third is to inspire every member of the Evergreen community as we move ahead to advance diversity here on our campus.
Now again, inspire, so that sounds very voluntary.
I'd like to read a list of core tenets developed by a group of anti-racist educators who were on a panel at the Race and Pedagogy Conference in Tacoma last year. Here are the tenets.
Okay, now we're going to stipulate some of the elements of our religion.
Racism exists today in both traditional and modern forms.
Now, what's interesting for me is that when I listen to these tenets, and some of you will kvetch at me about this, I agree with many of these tenets, and I just have very different ideas about what to do with the reality of racism. So I agree that racism is present today. Racism has not been abolished.
Racism is an institutionalized, multi-layered, multi-level system that distributes unequal power and resources between white people and people of color as socially identified.
And I can agree with that this is in fact what happens with racism. Now racism itself is not terribly easy to define precisely, and if you want a lesson in that, read Scott Alexander's Against Murderism. And in fact, even though we bandy about this term racism, it's actually pretty difficult to figure out, well, what specifically are we talking about? But I wouldn't argue with the fact that racism gets into institutions and can be amplified by institutions. That certainly happens all the time too. Now remember, I'm a Calvinist. Now some people say you shouldn't call yourself a Calvinist because you're not as deterministic as I think a Calvinist should be. Well, okay. But as a Calvinist, one of the things I do believe in is total depravity, and that when Mr. Reagan did his interview with me, I asked me if I was a racist, and I said, well, yeah. And he's kind of like, what do you mean you're a racist? I think I've got racism in my heart. Racism is part of the package of sin that all of us have in our human nature. And what I mean by that is we are all grown with biases, but I'm not saying that only white people have racism. I'm saying all people have racism. You can't help but have biases, and those biases are going to play out. And given where we are in history, some of those biases will be racial. But that is true of white people, of black people, of brown people, of people from every continent and language. It's just a part of growing up in this world. You will have biases, and because so many biases get tagged to racial elements, those are going to be all over the place. No argument with that.
And disproportionately benefits whites.
And if your group is in power, well, you're probably going to benefit your group.
All members of society are socialized to participate in the system of racism, albeit within varied social locations.
That sounds reasonable.
all white people benefit from racism, regardless of intentions.
That's a little broad because, and again, that's complicated, but there's a lot of truth to it.
No one chose to be socialized into racism, so no one is quote unquote bad, but no one is neutral. To not act against racism is to support racism.
That statement is just waiting for a theologian to jump in and say, bad, good. What are these categories? Shall we talk about them?
Racism must be continually identified, analyzed, and challenged. No one is ever done.
Okay, but here's something that a knowledge and experience within religious communities could offer. It's that, all going all the way back to Augustine and way before, there's something about forbidden fruit. If you keep putting energy into it, you might in fact make things worse. That sin is not something that is simply managed by us consciously. It's very different from that. And in fact, some of the worst sins we do are attempts to undo other sins. In that you're not just going to deal with racism from a frontal assault. That, quite frankly, is very naive about human beings.
The question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest in that situation?
Okay, now you're mapping this onto every situation, and right here we're going to begin to get into what is the problem with this whole thing, is that basically you've constructed a rather facile, simplistic hierarchy and said, well, equity is at the top, and we're defining equity as racism. It's like, okay, but you're the intersectionality people. Whatever happened to sexism? Whatever happened to class? Whatever happened to bias towards tall people? I've enjoyed tall privilege all my life. Well, not all my life, at least as since I've been tall. And I know that because I was kind of a late bloomer and I wasn't very tall in high school. Later on in college, I became tall, and it's like, hey, it's better to be tall than short, unless you're flying in an airplane. Then there's short privilege, and I sit there in misery in an airplane watching all these people with short privilege enjoy being able to move their legs, and I think, what it wouldn't be to be short. But once I get out into the terminal and I'm taller than everyone and can enjoy that privilege, well, then it goes. And see, this is why you in fact should think about hierarchies and pay attention to how they work. Because if you just say, well, here it is at the top of the hierarchy and we're going to orient ourselves with respect to this, well, and Jordan Peterson has done an excellent job of articulating this, you are in fact not going to be able to achieve your goals, because the world is way more complex than this.
The racial status quo is comfortable for most whites. Therefore, anything that maintains white comfort is suspect.
Oh, so now, see, and this is where things get really interesting, because we're going to try and make things more comfortable for people who have been traditionally discriminated against at the expense of the comfort for people who have traditionally benefited from discrimination. Okay. But again, you're going to begin, well, okay, so there you have race. Well, what about gender? Well, what about all these other categories? Pretty soon, what you're actually going to do is pathologize comfort. And this is where we get into the strange persistence of guilt, that the moment you start to feel comfortable, well, there must be something wrong. And again, if you've got a lot of experience in religious communities, you know all about this. If in many religious communities, this is an ongoing issue, that you're feeling comfortable, I must be doing something wrong. I must be taking advantage of someone. I must be sinning because this feels good. You know those impulses in religious communities, and as you live with them and as you continue to process them, you begin to create a far more nuanced understanding of, well, good and evil, right and wrong, morality, shalom, health, all of these things, which are in fact very much at play in the hierarchy. But you've completely eliminated that and just put one thing on top, and now you're all going to feel good about feeling guilty. Okay, well, turn the screw once more. You're feeling good about feeling guilty. that must be revealing something wrong. So now you should even feel guilty about feeling good about feeling guilty. But now you're feeling guilty, so you're feeling good about that. It's an endless cycle. And if you don't believe me, well, you should, because I've watched Calvinists and other Christians work through these issues and play these games and suffer for them sometimes for generations. This is read Christian, pious history, and you'll find these conversations all over the place. There is nothing new under the sun. And this is, now, you're all imagining this is all brand new and you're making this up and you're inventing it. And for the first time now, here at the imagined climax of history, we now will suddenly arrive at the golden age. No, ain't gonna happen.
The racially oppressed have a more intimate insight via experiential knowledge of the system of race than their racial oppressors.
That's absolutely true. The folks on the bottom of an arrangement always know the people on top of them better than the other way around. I don't know what it's like to be short, unless I remember about when I was short. The short person on the airplane doesn't know how I suffer, and I'm sitting there in that seat in the back of the airplane, and this short person in front of me puts their seat back and bangs into my legs, and then they start banging the seat. Why doesn't this seat go back further? It's because my legs are here. Well, your legs shouldn't be there. It's like, well, why don't you get in touch with your short privilege and understand my tall misery? But then once we get out to the gate and I can see over the whole crowd and find my airplane and they're trying to look up at everyone, well, why don't you get involved with your tall privilege instead of flaunting it over me and walking right past me with your long legs and running faster than I can through the airport with your large body and moving me out of the way when there's a line? There's all kinds of privilege. But do black people know a lot more about racism against them than most white people? Of course. But change matters. It'll be different.
However, white professors will be seen as having more legitimacy. Thus, positionality must be intentionally engaged.
Unless, in fact, you begin to change this, and now you say, well, these white professors will have less legitimacy because they're white, so now suddenly we're going to fawn on black professors. Now you've just given them privilege. Now you've just set up the same dynamic that you said was problematic. So, again, coming from a religious point of view, there's no end to these systems. And I'm not saying they're illegitimate. I am saying they're not as simply addressed as you might imagine. And if you get real tyrannical about addressing them, you'll just be setting up more suffering, which was, ironically, the thing that you said you wanted to eliminate. Oh, but these certain people can suffer, and these certain people will suffer, and these people will not suffer at the expense of these people. Well, now you're bringing up hell to try and grasp at your heaven.
Resistance is a predictable reaction to anti-racist education and must be explicitly and strategically addressed.
And this is all this therapeutic language. But again, this one should make you stop and say, anyone who disagrees with me is what? Evil? Unwoke? Again, as many of the atheists are pointing out, religious people have been playing these games for a long time. You've just switched terms, but it's the same game. And as a religious person, I'll say, yeah. And you know what? It doesn't work well in the church because we play this game a lot. It doesn't help people in the church. It doesn't help towards your imagined goal of bringing new people in the church. It's a bad game. Now you're going to take it on. It's not going to be good.
I believe these core tenets can be a guide for our work moving forward with actions to educate ourselves and our students.
And if you read the Apostle Paul, he would say, there's a funny thing that happens with law. You can have the best laws in the world, and what our human hearts can do with them is create sin with them. So in other words, within Christianity, there's even a critique of law. In other words, once you set up, let's say, 10 commandments, well, you've now privileged those who, for whatever reason, are more able to keep them, and allow these people to rise in the community, often with self-righteousness, which is critically dangerous. Again, all of this stuff has been worked on in religious communities for a very long time, and now suddenly, oh, we have these rules, we can make the world better. Yeah, read the Old Testament. Did the covenant make Israel better? Some ways. Did it also condemn them? Yeah. Read the Apostle Paul. Same issues. This stuff isn't new.
We galvanize white privilege in the form of curriculum, exalting white canons of fine art, literature, theory, and scientific thinking. More so, if we don't examine how those canons are made.
So you're going to get rid of all the old books? You're only going to have books written after a certain date by certain professors? Again, look at Christian schools who only read safe books by safe Christians, and look how peculiar Christians can get. Well, we're only going to read Calvinist authors. We're not going to read Arminian authors, and we're only going to read Christians after the Reformation. We're not going to read those church fathers. We're only going to read the New Testament and then the Reformation and then whatever pastor we think has it right now. We've been playing these games in Christian churches for a very long time, and I'll tell you, it doesn't go good. But, okay.
I believe we are capable of unlearning the habits of mind that perpetuate white privilege.
And you don't see the contradiction in everything you've just said before this one?
What I am uncertain of is our collective will to examine those habits.
Oh, now we're Arminian. Now this is all about the will. And so what you really need to save yourself is to really screw down hard on that will, and by social pressure, get people to comply. Again, Christians have been working with this stuff for a very long time.
This I believe. I believe Evergreen.
Now we're having stand up. This is testimony time. This is church.
Can create a more vibrant community of anti-racist activists on our staff and faculty and among our students, if we break our 45-year pattern of occasionally turning toward these issues briefly with deep but short-run commitment that fades, and fades.
This is liturgical.
Our words of action disappearing into the background as we return to business as usual. Breaking this cycle will take sustained and stubborn leadership from our administration and at least a doubling of our staff and faculty of color. This I do believe.
I believe deeply in the critical and audacious goal of eliminating racism and violence in our world. I believe we're all privileged to engage in that work in a learning community that wants to be better.
And what's so funny is that it's mostly white folks doing this. And what amazes me is that...
And I believe we have the will to do so. Thank you for coming today.
See, part of what this does is make all of us keep looking at race in a certain way. This is putting more energy into the racial system. And what you're going to wind up doing is, in fact, promoting racism in the name of eliminating it, which I think is exactly what we're seeing. There's all the applause.
There was a faculty meeting with an unusual agenda. The agenda involved the faculty voting to require our union to insert into our contract a provision in which every faculty member would reflect on their own growth relative to their personal racism each and every year in their self-evaluation.
Again, in a Christian college or in a church, we would want the faculty or the clergy to every year reflect on, are they growing in Christ? Now, we've been around this kind of stuff a long time, and we know, well, let's ask them to reflect on it, and then let's have them report it. Maybe let's score them. You know, Jamie got a score of 8 in pursuing Jesus this year, and Jennifer only got a 6. And it's like, Christians for a long time have known this game doesn't work. Now again, pay attention. We don't just have one idea, equity, on the top of our hierarchy. We've got a person, Jesus, who we want to live up to. But built within that person is a whole, is a complexity that you cannot arrive at by naming one aspect. And that is a critical difference. And I'm going to talk about some of the other differences later. To me, a lot of this goes into I think John McWhorter has said some of the best stuff about this. So I want to pull up that video, but I didn't queue it up here. So okay, I'm going to play some of my favorite video with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter talking about race.
Change. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm talking around the fact that, as Glenn was referring to, the idea that freshmen are now given Ta-Nehisi Coates' book to read, to me, basically just stops the race debate in its tracks. If it's going to be like that, then I'm not in it until some time passes. This is what I mean. There are two problems. One is a white problem. One is a black problem. I'm going to do the white one first. It has become a matter of religious faith among educated white people in America to feel a sense of atonement for being racist. When I say that it's religious, I don't mean that as a kind of trash talk. I don't mean that as a way of getting attention. I mean that it has become a matter of what any anthropologist who had no pre-existent biases would identify as a religious faith. We don't use the word religion, but it is a faith. And that is the idea that, for example, I'm going to use a phrase that we're all so used to, but really break it down. America needs to come to terms with racism. Okay. What terms? What does that mean? Come to terms. What would the situation be if America came to those terms? Let's imagine the America that we're all about to walk back into after this seminar. This is an America where America has come to terms. What? Is it about something that would be written? Is it about conversations that would be had? What are the terms? One imagines a certain musical soundtrack, but that's a movie. What are the terms? It has no meaning at all that America would come to terms. Does it mean reparations for slavery? Because we've talked about that and nothing comes of it, and yet we keep talking about the coming to terms. It means nothing. What it means is that educated whites now consider it a mark of being morally advanced to acknowledge their inner racists. And the idea is that at some point, America will come to terms with that racism. But what are the terms? That has no meaning except as an analogy to Christian theological conceptions. It's about a judgment day. It's about this time when all of a sudden something happens where white people are absolved of their inner racism, and then we move on. But obviously, in terms of the lives that we're leading, walking around with our bottles of water, that has no meaning at all. And so, that's not activism. To be a white person and to think, I am racist, I have white privilege, I'm going to acknowledge this all the time, does nothing for the black people that Glenn was just talking about. It's something that's inwardly directed. It's very humane, it's well-intended, but it has nothing to do with anything that Dr. King was talking about. It has nothing to do with anything that the civil rights movement was about. It's an inwardly turned and, frankly, idle matter. I have not written about this because I think it would be mean to the people who convene Aspen, but I'll say it here, that I was at Aspen in 2017, and various things were discussed at Aspen. It was a very smart event. All sorts of brilliance was going on at Aspen. But, of course, at one point in the middle, there was this event that was about racism in the 21st century. Okay, so racism in the 21st century. Now, the question would be, given all the other events, what were we going to learn at this event? What was the new thing? But there was nothing to learn. I went to this thinking to myself, I shouldn't go, but I'm black and I'm at Aspen and there aren't that many black people. I should go. And I'm going to learn about, the racism here at Aspen. So I went. The food was spectacular. Now, it was run by one of my favorite black commentators. I'm not going to name who she was, but I really wish they had not wasted her time doing this. And there were 3 panelists. And everybody who was black at Aspen went to it, and a lot of the white people as well. This event had no substance whatsoever. It was church. It was literally church. No one would have used the word church, but there was this church service in the middle of Aspen. So, an eminent black foundation director, who I will not name, talked about how when he was coming up in the business, he would not wear casual clothes on Casual Friday where he worked because he thought that it wouldn't be good for a black person to do that. And everybody clapped. That was considered very funny. Then a middle-aged, I know I'm middle-aged too, a middle-aged white man talked about how he has a coach to teach him about white privilege every week. Somebody comes to his house every week and teaches him that he's privileged as a white person, and everybody clapped. In other words, he has a pastor. And then everybody left, and everybody talked about how wonderful this event had been. Nobody learned anything. That event served for white people at Aspen to atone for being racist, and everybody went off and actually learned things. It was a church service. That is the way things are now. Every third story on Slate is a church service. Every third story at NPR is a church service. It really doesn't help anything. To acknowledge that racism is something more abstract than cross burnings on lawns is one thing. To walk around thinking of it as a permanent stain that you must always atone for and never really will until America, quote unquote, comes to terms with racism is fiction. It is something as benighted and idle as something that we might see in an unlettered tribe and find curious. That is the white problem.
And then he goes on to the black problem, but I'll leave a link to that. Watch the whole video. It's a great video. Now, how does this work? Well, equity is at the top of their hierarchy, and they somehow have equated equity with racism, but you can dare bet that that association can change probably instantly, depending on, see now, Heather hiring Brett Weinstein's wife, she basically saw this as a strategic move for the president to undo what they wanted. Now, I'm very not familiar. I don't doubt what she has to say. I'm not going to weigh in on that. But here's the thing. Once you put something at the top of the hierarchy there that you put there, you can also take it out. You can also move it. This is not going to create a stable community, partly because equity is so amorphous and can be associated with so many different things, and there are near infinite aspects to associate with it. Well, it can go in any direction. But so your top value will not only govern, it will limit. Your top value will bring all other values into alignment around it. And I was going to, in previous iterations of this video, I was going to spend some time talking about bounded set and center set, but I don't have time. I'd like to talk about that in another video. Now, Brett Weinstein is actually very much onto this, and in a very interesting podcast with Dax Shepard, he talked about this, and what he says here is very much correct.
We are often juggling.
Actually, this is Dax talking.
2, 3 ideals. We're actively trying to service 3 ideals that are often contradictory. So even in our Constitution, we have equality and we have liberty. And these things are often mutually exclusive. And yet we value both. And what we fail to recognize is, at best, we will have the pendulum somewhere the majority agrees with. We will never have all liberty, and we will never have all equality. And so just starting the conversation with, look, we're all going to have to give a bit. We both want both these things to be thriving, yet we know they can't both be thriving. And for people are so drawn to decisiveness. This is one of the things people loved about Donald Trump, is things were quite black and white for him, and there's comfort in that decisiveness. There's a lot of unease in some weird compromise. Is it 60% equality, 40% liberty? That's uncomfortable for us, but I think we're going to have to learn to explore that more and think of that as a zone we're going to live in. Am I making any sense?
Oh, yeah. And this is actually one of my favorite points, because I think there's actually something very hopeful at the end of it, which is if you get to the stage of having an adult conversation, which we're having trouble with in public, but privately it's possible, where you do say, hey, you know what? It's not that liberty and equality cannot both thrive. They actually can. What you can't do is maximize either one, right? Anytime you try to maximize a single parameter, every other value you have will crash as a result. So anybody who's got a one parameter objective can't be allowed near the levers of power.
Which is exactly what happened at his former employer. So I think they make an excellent thing. But now pay attention that liberty and equality are both these abstract terms, and they're at play in a world with multiple variables. Now, why this is still a Christendom civil war. Christianity delivered a devastating egalitarian payload into world culture. And Luke, Introduction to Philosophy, I should pull it up. But one of the ways that Christianity changed world culture, and Tom Holland sees this, and N.T. Wright, as they talked about what happened with the Apostle Paul, is it's implicit in Genesis and the Imago Dei, and it gets radically pursued by Jesus. So the least of these, this value, the least of these gets put into the mix. Now, and Rod Dreher says, well, that then kind of gets disconnected from Christianity and gets put up to the top of the hierarchy, and he says, well, that was communism. Now, communism was kind of playing some other games, but the same thing that happened with communism will happen with this same pursuit because of the way human beings are. So Jesus radically pursued the least of these, but he also practiced the greatest is the servant of all. And he did so at the expense of his own life. And he did so at the expense of his own life with, again, the promised resurrection, which continues to change this iron box of secularism. Yet Christianity also never gives up on hierarchy. So you have the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity at the top of the hierarchy, and listen to Jonathan Peugeot's channel, hierarchies automatically form. And so what Christianity does is there are hierarchies and there are equalities, and they live in tension with each other. And that is, in a sense, this liberty-equality tension, but it's even more diverse and broader and vaster than that. Because here, what happens in Christianity is you often have the inversion of the hierarchy. And Jesus says that the greatest among you will be the servant of all. So we invert the hierarchy. The Son of God becomes the scapegoat, and all the sins of the world are placed on him. And he also then becomes the sacrificial lamb. Christianity is always playing with these concepts, but it does so in a long, rich, historical conversation that the church never gets fully right, and we've just had we've had decades of getting it wrong and compensating, and getting it wrong and compensating, and getting it wrong and compensating. Now suddenly we imagine, well, let's just throw everything old out the window because of patriarchy and racism, and we're just going to get it right the first shot by putting equity at the top of the hierarchy. Ain't going to happen. It is just not going to happen. And the reason I say it won't happen is because many have tried, and if you want to read some history, you can see the innumerable yet predictable ways that it always falls apart, because every instantiation has to have a person at the top, and that person is continually vulnerable to all the things that normally flawed people are vulnerable. Is it racism? Is it sexism? Is it greed? Is it avarice? Is it pride? Is it desire for control? You always have a person at the top of the hierarchy, and that person will always be fallible. Now, if you go back to the Jordan Peterson biblical lectures, and I didn't take the time to find that clip and pull it up, but one of the things that he notes is that what happened in Christianity in the early period is that they resisted the ancient Near East and then Eastern practice that went all the way to Rome of divinizing the emperors. See, it makes sense in a system like that to say, well, Pharaoh or emperor is divine. You put him at the top of the hierarchy. But Christianity doesn't do that. Why? Christianity preserved the instantiation of the top of the hierarchy offshore, above the iron box of secularism. Why is that important? Because the king is always subject and accountable to God. God alone, who is incorruptible. God alone is at the top. And God is able to manage many complex ideals. And if you have a God at the top, you resist what we call idolatry. What is idolatry? Idolatry is taking a good thing or even a good idea and making it an ultimate ideal. The problem is, let's say you make equity your ultimate ideal. Well, now suddenly liberty or other expressions of shalom are going to suffer because of it. And in fact, having a person at the top rather than simply an ideal means that there is in fact more flexibility that can account for unpredictable and innumerable complex contexts that will come onto the scene. Okay? And so that's why, and Peterson points this out in the biblical series, that's why in Christianity, the king is never at the top. Now, this gets played out even in our own system in democracies. In Western democracies, we have this saying, no one is above the law. You place the law above the ruler. And in a sense, what you do is you divinize a constitutional process. The weakness of that, as we always see, is that constitutional processes are susceptible to corruption and manipulation. And that's why, again, in the Christian system, God is above it all, and God exacts judgments on those underneath who violate his law, violate shalom, sin, or miss the mark. That's why a secular system is always vulnerable to that which is common to all of us. So if you can only imagine religion is overt and not in fact the expression of those highest axioms within your own system, or the highest axioms that are actually built into the fully layered, what I would call as a Christian, created order. If you imagine religion is only overt connections to ancient mythos, you fail to realize what religion is, and you or your rivals' religious behaviors will surprise you. And that's exactly what's happening. Well, I'll get under 2 hours and I'll get home for dinner. So I'm at the end. And this could have been a whole lot longer, and I've been really struggling to get this video out because there's so much I would love to talk about with respect to this. But I thought a good way to conclude it was this part from Tim Keller's lecture at Princeton Theological Seminary. Now, many of you might not know what surrounded this. Tim Keller was offered the Kuiper Prize at Princeton Seminary. Now, there's a lot of politics in this, but that announcement was not well received. You remember earlier in the video I talked about Old Princeton and how Old Princeton, basically the modernists won that fight and the conservatives all left the institution. Years later, a big donor came along and wanted to offer a Kuiper Prize. Kuiper after Abraham Kuyper of the Netherlands. Now, there's a little bit of tension in that because Abraham Kuyper's rise came as a response to Christian modernism. And Kuiper then became a conservative, and he even became Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He was a newspaper editor. He was quite a polymath. Well, the scholarship committee decided to give the Kuiper Prize to Tim Keller. Well, who was Tim Keller? Tim Keller's a minister in the Presbyterian Church of America. Well, Presbyterian Church of America does not ordain women to ecclesiastical office. It is, in that respect, more conservative than the Christian Reformed Church where I serve. Tim Keller also is not affirming of LGBT issues. And so what happened at Princeton was that there was an uproar amongst the student body, and they clamored and yelled at the administration to unaward Tim Keller the prize. There was eventually a negotiation, and Tim Keller was allowed to give a speech because he had prepared it, and I thought he gave a terrific speech, and you can find it answering Leslie Newbegin, a whole nother scholar. Actually, I rewatched this morning because of an email that I got from someone. I referred to this video a number of months ago, but listening to it this morning, I thought Tim Keller really articulates how Christianity breaks the assumptions of the polarizations that we in our contexts get locked into by speaking from outside of them and having been developed over hundreds of years and many, many test cases of, frankly, failure to our own ideals and, obviously speaking in a Christian manner, betrayal of our Lord. And the whole speech is great, but I'll just play a little part of it that I think is germane to this context.
A unique, category-disrupting social project. The fourth thing is a unique, category-disrupting social project.
That's what he says Christianity offers, a unique, category-disrupting social project that actually disrupts just about everything because, again, we're sinful human beings, and we always corrupt our own projects that we set up to align them with whatever we want.
Now, anybody who knows Newbegin knows one of his most famous and influential state ideas is that the community, in fact, the congregation, is the hermeneutic of the gospel.
Now, what that means is that you can have an ideal, you can put words on pages, but actually that which interprets and expresses and bears witness to the gospel is this flawed human community that, again, speaking as a Christian pastor, by the power of the Holy Spirit, always imperfectly expresses and bears witness to Jesus in a contemporary context, at a local zip code.
That you embody the gospel in your community, and in a sense that proclaims the gospel more powerfully than your words. Or, put it this way, your words will not in any way hit home unless it's backed up by a community that embodies the words. So that's all great, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, well, what does that community look like? And let me just suggest we read Newbegin on this alongside of a guy named Larry Hurtado of Edinburgh University, or emeritus now, New Testament scholar, has recently written a book called Destroyer of the Gods, looking at the first early Christian church, the early Christian church, and how they had a missionary encounter with their culture. And a big part of their missionary encounter was the fact that he calls it a social project. They had a particular kind of community that broke through the categories. They were offensive and attractive. And here are the 5 things. Now listen, the 5 things that early Christian church was marked by. Number 1, it was far more multi-ethnic and multiracial than any religious community anybody had ever seen. Number 2, it was more generous for the poor, more committed to the poor and the marginalized than they'd ever seen. You know, the Emperor Julian had this famous statement saying, the trouble with these Christians, the reason why they're growing is they don't take care of just their own poor, but ours as well. Number 3, you were marked by non-retaliation and forgiveness. In other words, if you went and you burned down a Christian's house and you beat them up and you killed them, they never got together and went to your house and burned your house down and killed you. Never. Number 4, I'll say this carefully and explain, they were positively against abortion and infant exposure. Now the reason I use the word,
As you know, abortion existed, but it wasn't very safe. It was much more common. What you did with an unwanted child was infant exposure, you put them out on the garbage, and they either died there or somebody took them and made them slaves. Christians were positively against that. They didn't just forbid their women to do that. They went out and brought the kids in and took care of them and raised them. So in other words, they were committed to the problem and the whole problem. They didn't just prohibit it. And number 5, they were a sexual counterculture. That is to say, they were far stricter in the area of sexual ethics, far stricter than the Roman world around them. And both Larry Hurtado and Kyle Harper, in his book From Shame to Sin, say that what's weird is, though the Christian rules of sexual conduct looked so incredibly strict, the underlying logic, they said, the underlying vision of sexuality was actually considerably higher and more attractive, and as a result, over the years, over the centuries, that logic won out. Now, here's what I want to say. Let's show you what I'm saying pretty quickly. 2 of those 5 things look like Democrats would do them. 2 of them are racial and economic justice. 2 of those 5 sound Republican and conservative, right? The prohibition of abortion, infant exposure, and the traditional sex ethics. So 2 of them look like liberal, Democrat. 2 of them look like Republican, and one of them, dare I say it? Okay, I'll say it. The one on non-retaliation and forgiveness, that doesn't look like any. Here's the point. Most Christians I know would like to drop 2 of those. The 2 that are, that don't fit in with the party they belong to. But do you not see that one of the greatest ways to explain that the gospel is not the product of a particular culture, but actually comes from God, is that the community that it creates would actually break through the categories? Do we have communities like that? Not many. Okay, number 5.
Now, notice, he says, the communities that we imagine from the New Testament church would break through the categories, break through the polarization that we have here. Do we have those communities? Not many. Notice what he doesn't do. Okay, we're going to be that community now, and it doesn't work that way. We certainly want to practice justice, but we're also going to believe in liberty. Well, then we're never going to get there. Well, that's probably true on every account. We're not never, but not in the age of decay. But this is what we're striving for. And we're not going to kill you if you fail it. And yet we're going to hold each other accountable and strive for it. Out of fear? Out of fear because the administration is going to come down on us? No, there will be accountability, but it's a kind of voluntary accountability. Like if I say, I'd really like to lose weight and I'd like you to hold me accountable and ask me if I'm still having that dish of ice cream every night when I probably should just be having another glass of water. Well, do I like it if you ask me about if I had that dish of ice cream? No, because I want to eat that dish of ice cream, but I'm complex in that. And there's something I want, and so it's voluntary. So as you can see, religion isn't a bad thing. But what you're going to have to do is figure out, well, what can you learn from it? And how can you arrive at it? How can we, in fact? Do you want to be racist? No. Understand that racism is far more complex than just saying, I won't be racist anymore. It's just, and again, in churches we've dealt with this. It's like sin is far more complex than I'm not going to sin anymore. Oh, yes, you are. Well, now you're just being dismissive of it. No, I'm not. I'm gonna see that, in fact, so often when I try not to sin in certain ways, I wind up sinning in other ways. And now I might just be thinking about 1 or 2 things, and now we've got an entire community. So how does a community approach this? Not in the way Evergreen is. Now, I'm told that their student enrollment is way down because here's the thing. Nobody really likes living under a tyranny, whether it's a tyranny associated with an ancient religious mythos, or if it's a tyranny associated with a contemporary idealistic utopian, aggressive ethos. Nobody wants to live that way. Well, why? Well, at the same time, we don't want to live in disorder. And so, well, now we're working that order chaos thing again. So, I don't know if this video is any good. It's taken me a few hours to do it. I've been unable to get a lot of videos out. I hope there was something helpful in here. I hope it was worth your time. And again, I'm still wrestling with this to try and get my ideas succinct, because I just have so many ideas about this, because when I watch these new religions arise, and sometimes within the church, I think, you're forgetting everything. You're forgetting a lot of what we've learned over the years. And actually, when it arises in the church, there are actually resources that you can call people to and say, now, wait a minute. You're also committed to this over here, and that's going to balance this. So certainly there is a history of racism. Certainly there is a history of bias. Certainly we have messed things up. But your theology that says, well, if we only make these institutional and structural changes, or if we only adopt this language, then somehow we can get rid of these things. Well, not if you've been paying attention to any kind of religious history. It's far more complex than that. So again, I hope this was helpful. An hour and 45 minutes, not the longest I've ever done, but really wanted to get something out just besides the interviews. And thanks again for all of you who have agreed to let me post your interviews. I know for many of you it's a little bit hard. Should I let them post it? Should I not? And I know that there is risk, but in many of these conversations, I think there are things that others can benefit from, and I think we see that in the comment section. And for the most part, I think people have been well behaved in the comment section, and I'm really pleased by that. So thanks for watching.